Hey everybody, welcome to the briefing room on this Wednesday. I'm Devin Dwyer, Washington. Mary Alice Parks, our Deputy Political Director, and we're very happy to be joined today with our senior investigative producer as well, John Santucci, fresh off a big interview with Sarah Sanders, who hasn't been in her own briefing room for quite some time, but you'll bring us the headlines in a second. We should also let you know that we are following some big news out of Georgia today in the fight over abortion in this country. Georgia becoming the 4th state just this year to pass and sign a law that would ban abortion after 6 weeks. We'll talk to both sides in that fight coming up. Stay tuned for that. But first, let's get to the headlines. John, with this new interview with Sarah Sanders, we are all wondering whether we're going to hear from Bob Mueller. The president tweeted over the weekend. But what does she have to say about this?
So Sarah Sanders doing a rare interview, actually, about anything related to the investigation on the Investigation podcast here at ABC. And we asked her about the weekend tweets about the president, talking about Robert Mueller. He should not testify. The Attorney General, of course, said under oath that he is not against Robert Mueller testifying. Take a listen to what Sarah Sanders said to us. Should we take the president's tweet from this past weekend as an order to Bill Barr to not allow Robert Mueller to testify?
I think that's a determination to be made at this point. I think that's the president's. That's the president's feeling on the matter, and the reason is because we consider this as a case closed, as a finished process. And I think that most Americans think that this is finished.
Right,
they're sick and tired of hearing about it.
Right, but now what has been the dialogue, though, between the president and his attorney general about this? Has he said to Bill Barr, hey, don't let Bob Mueller testify?
I'm not aware of any conversation between the two of them on that matter.
Do you expect something like that to happen?
I'm not aware that a date has even been set for that conversation to need to take place, so we'll see what happens. But again, this matter in our eyes is over and done with, and it's time to get back to America's business.
So, of course, Sarah Sanders there speaking to ABC. She was saying, Devin, that a determination has not been made yet on this matter. The president feels extremely strongly, as we saw from that tweet. He did not mince words. But for Sarah to say that there is potentially a conversation that could happen between the attorney general and the president about this. Remember, the attorney general is Robert Mueller's boss. Mueller is still a DOJ employee. So if his boss tells him, hey, we don't want you to do this, may not see him after all.
This is a big deal, Mary Alice, because Republicans have expressed an openness to hearing from Bob Mueller. Democrats, of course, are demanding it. So for Sarah Sanders to now come out and basically affirm the president's tweet and say, you know, we very well could put the kibosh on the opportunity to hear from Bob Mueller, the guy who spent 2 years working on this report, is an enormous deal.
Yeah, she's saying that they think the case is closed at the exact same time that Democrats are saying, hold on, we want to tear the whole thing wide open. They want the notes. They want the full unredacted version. They want Bob Mueller to come sit in the hot seat. Yep. They want the president's tax returns. So they think they're just getting going at the same time Republicans want to put this all behind them. But I was struck by the fact that Sarah even hinted that there would be that level of conversation between the president and the AG, because that could just be incredibly politically perilous for both of them if they came out and said that they are actively going to keep Robert Mueller from the seat.
Absolutely, and I think it also gets into this idea the president for so long had been saying, I'm going to leave it to the attorney general, almost keeping a distance from it. But now, to your point, just to wade right in, that there would be this dialogue happening, I mean, you could open a whole nother investigation.
Right, hard to imagine there wouldn't be serious blowback.
Yeah.
And don't you think Bob Mueller is sort of in a class of his own as we watch the White House clash with Capitol Hill right now over subpoenas, letters going back and forth, witnesses want to come forward, documents. I mean, you get the sense that people are sort of confused and flustered by all the sub-headlines here, but Bob Mueller is someone that everyone sort of identifies with and presumably would want to hear from. The guy hasn't been heard from since he started this thing.
Over 2 years we have not heard from Robert Mueller. I think we've seen him a couple times outside of church, and he runs away. I mean, we don't see him much. He was out having dinner last night.
Yeah, he was out at the paparazzi there. Look at that photo from AP. Caught him in Georgetown last night at Martin's Tavern, which has been around forever.
That guy photographs quite well. But anyway, moving on. You know, but I do think there's a lot of subtext here going on, to your point. There's a lot of other headlines. What else is happening with these investigations? I do think one of the coming attractions we sort of saw in this conversation with Sarah is this idea of executive privilege, right? Could the White House, whom have not invoked executive privilege for the 2 years that Robert Mueller had been investigating him. Could they finally do it? Sarah told us that it's a door they have not closed, and it could be something maybe in the next couple of days there's something. Now she's always, teetering language there. We need not to look too much into it. However, look at the response we saw today from this White House and from former White House counsel Don McGahn in responding to Capitol Hill. We're not coming. Every action we are seeing so far, Congress says we want this, White House says, meh, that's not going to happen. It does feel like you're getting to a point that they're looking potentially at executive privilege, and what that means is that you get this ironclad wall that will come up, and it's sort of like case closed for Congress that wants to open this whole thing back open.
Well, it begins court cases, without a doubt. And in previous administrations, that claim of executive privilege hasn't always been greeted with friendly open arms in the courts.
Well, no, it wouldn't. Right?
I mean, in fact, we've seen the courts often say that it's hard to claim executive privilege and have knocked it down on multiple occasions.
One thing we know for sure, though, is that those court cases take a very long time, which is another reason why the White House doesn't seem to be in any big hurry to declare executive privilege. They can take their time. They could declare it months from now, which will further delay this process, which is exactly what they want.
Keep the ball down the road. I mean, look how they've dealt with different committees between Jerry Nadler and the House Oversight Committee. I mean, they have just kept the ball going and going and going. But it has been a really interesting time just to watch this back and forth.
A great conversation with Sarah Sanders on the new podcast. It's called The Investigation. It's available now on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. John Santucci, Kira Phillips as well in that conversation. Take a listen. Just out today. John, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Mary Alice, this is also enraging Democrats, to say the least. All of this, the stonewalling, et cetera. And we heard from Nancy Pelosi today, who was sort of sounding off on this as well.
Right. She seemed to admit that she is fighting against a growing wave of support for impeachment. And she says the Republicans are goading her base. I was struck by the fact that she basically argued that every time Republicans stonewall a request, they make it easier for Democrats to point to evidence for why they should begin impeachment proceedings. So let's listen to that.
Let's take a listen.
Every day he's obstructing justice by saying this one shouldn't testify, that one shouldn't testify, and the rest. So he's making a case, but he's just trying to goad us into impeachment. And wherever you go, I say to my colleagues, whatever it is, be ready. And whatever it is, we'll be ready. Trump is goading us to impeach him. That's what he's doing. Every single day, he's just like taunting, because he knows that it would be very divisive in the country, but he doesn't really care. Just wants to solidify his base.
Mary Alice, we have Cheyenne Hazlitt, one of our political reporters, joining us here in this conversation. But Mary Alice, sort of give us the big picture here. Democrats are really between a rock and a hard place on this. They are enraged by the stonewalling from the White House. You hear Nancy Pelosi tried to channel some of that, but yet she wants to stop short of proceeding on impeachment, and she's having a heck of a hard time keeping her party together on that.
And she was hoping that they'd be able to continue these investigations, tick through some of the process there in the Judiciary Committee, in some of the other committees, while at the same time ticking through a legislative agenda. But as much as Republicans continue to stonewall the investigations, it derails the conversation. It puts the spotlight back on those investigations, which only adds fuel to that fire for impeachment. You know, I think that it's also noteworthy that Republicans talk about impeachment as much as Democrats. They are very aware that it is unpopular nationwide. They do think it is divisive, as Nancy Pelosi just said there. And so they like kind of ginning up this storyline because they think that plays in their favor as well. They like to tag Democrats with this before Democrats even do anything with it. Exactly.
They see political advantage there. And you cover Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren of Massachusetts, Cheyenne, and she today, to this very point, was on the floor of the United States Senate making quite a scene about the need to impeach President Trump immediately.
Right. Definitely a different response from that side of the field. Senator Elizabeth Warren took to the Senate floor and she read from that Mueller report for 20 minutes, making the point almost page by page that she's not letting a single detail go. And this coming after Warren was the first 2020 Democrat to call for impeachment proceedings to begin on President Donald Trump. So today she really upped that call for urgency and said, I'm here to say one more time in public, this is not about politics, which she's been saying. This is about protecting the Constitution of the United States, States. And she says the way we do that is we begin impeachment proceedings now against this president. So definitely a reminder to McConnell, to Republicans, and to other Democrats that she is not taking a seat on the call for impeachment proceedings.
Yeah, she's trying to stake out that turf in the campaign, of course, in the policy arena as well, on the floor of the United States Senate. One person who's taking sort of the Pelosi side of things, as sort of a more moderate approach to the president's stonewalling and the calls for impeachment, is former Vice President Joe Biden. He's out in Nevada today campaigning out there and raising some cash. That's where our Molly Nagel is taking along with him today and joins us now. Molly, what's Biden's view on all of this debate, both about having Mueller testify and about impeachment?
Provide to the security and joy of your family.
Well, Joe Biden is speaking behind me, so apologies if it's a little hard to hear. But Joe Biden has been pretty clear that he views impeachment as Congress's job. They should continue their investigations, and if they're blocked by the administration, that's when they should move to impeachment. But his job is to take on impeachment and Donald Trump at the ballot box, so taking him on there rather than pushing for impeachment himself. Now, he is talking about Trump's attempt to block Mueller's testimony before Congress. He sent out a fundraising asking people to sign their name if they felt that it was inappropriate for President Trump to try and block Mueller from testifying and let Attorney General Bill Barr be the last word on the Mueller report.
All right, Molly Nagel for us there in a very loud room with Joe Biden. Molly, thanks so much for coming in. Happening now out in Las Vegas. And just to button that up, Mary Alice, Democrats in the Joe Biden camp, if you will, the Pelosi camp, really want to be cautious on impeachment. They think that there's a big liability there.
Absolutely, but both have also been careful to not close the door completely. Even Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi have said that they want to tick through these investigations and basically see if the time comes that warrants it. And again, like we started this conversation, if Republicans continue to stonewall every step of the congressional investigations, it's hard to imagine at some point that point doesn't arrive.
Right, exactly. It's going to be fascinating, though, to see whether Bob Mueller himself actually weighs in on this debate, and certainly that will be the next big shoe to drop on that story. We'll continue to follow it. Cheyenne, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for coming in. Shifting gears now to another major story developing right now out of Georgia. This is part of a bigger narrative in this country of a push for abortion restrictions across dozens of states. Georgia today actually became the fourth state just this year to pass and sign a law that would ban abortion after a fetal heartbeat can be detected. That's typically around 6 weeks into pregnancy. That's before many women even know that they're pregnant. Quite a controversial bill, to say the least. Republican Governor Brian Kemp of that state signed it today. He had this to say as he signed the bill into law. Take a listen.
I understand, like the others have said, that some oppose this legislation. I realize that some may challenge it in the court of law. But our job is to do what is right, not what is easy. Through the Life Act, we will allow precious babies to grow up and realize their full God-given potential.
Now, as you said, this has been a part of a years-long trend, Republicans, and essentially working around the courts so that even if it is still legal to get an abortion, working to make sure that it becomes harder and harder or nearly impossible in some of these conservative states. So I think we should bring in Joshua Edmonds, who we have, the executive director of the Georgia Life Alliance, who was one of the co-sponsors of this bill. Joshua, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Thanks so much for having us today.
Yeah, so explain, what is the goal of this new legislation in Georgia?
So HB 41, the Life Act, the intention behind the bill is to find that balance between the difficult circumstances that women find themselves in and recognizing the compelling interest that the state has in protecting innocent life in the womb. And so we've got this balanced language struck in this bill that says that when a baby in the womb has a heartbeat, a beating heart, that at that point on in Georgia, you'll no longer be able to have an abortion. And then for those women who find themselves in difficult financial circumstances, we've also got a tax exemption written into the bill that would allow for families who incur those costs during pregnancy to be able to save on an average $238 a year to go towards those costs through this bill, as well as enabling child support for a baby in the womb with a beating heart. So we're providing this balanced approach to respecting and protecting life in the womb and supporting mothers and families throughout our state.
And are there any exceptions written into the bill?
There are. The original version of the bill had no exceptions. It actually even removed the current exceptions that were in the law written in 2012 from a different group that was sponsoring legislation back then. And the bill was introduced with no exceptions in it. The bill that was signed today does include exceptions for rape and incest and for a baby that the doctor determines would not survive life outside of the womb after birth.
What about for the health of the mother?
So this bill does not include a health of the mother language. The medical community in Georgia is so world class that our medical professionals recognize that they're able to accommodate those difficult medical circumstances to protect both mother and baby. And so there was no need to provide that exception in our law. And so there's no health of the mother exception. There is an exception in there that basically says if there is going to be a direct threat to the life of the mother, and the only way to treat the mother is to remove the baby from the womb in order to treat the mother, that the doctor can then remove the baby and provide the best care possible to both mother and baby, while still recognizing that the doctor is actually treating two patients rather than one.
Joshua, your state, Georgia, is the latest in a growing list of states that are seeking to push legislation of the type that your state signed into law today. Let's take a look at the list for our viewers. Georgia joins several states with heartbeat bills already in effect: Ohio, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Dakota, Iowa. Among them, we also have, I think, 10 other states that have introduced similar legislation. Interestingly, though, none of those laws have taken effect, including in North Dakota, the first back in 2013. Lower court struck that down. The Supreme Court declined to hear it. What makes you confident that this particular bill will sort of survive the legal challenges that are sure to come here?
That's a great question. So the Life Act here in Georgia is unique to any other legislation like it in the country. And what our bill does is actually we explored the oral arguments and the written decision of Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton that established legal abortion in America back in 1973. And if you look in the oral arguments and in the decision of Roe, it says that if a state who has a compelling interest in protecting innocent life were able to establish personhood for a baby in the womb, that there would be no legal grounds for abortion, because at that point, the guaranteed right to life for the baby would be assured by the 14th Amendment. And actually, the counsel arguing in favor of abortion in that case conceded that point and said it's absolutely right. If you had personhood for the child, there's no right to abortion because you can't legally guarantee a right to kill another person in our country. And so what the bill does, right in the first opening lines of the Life Act, HB 41, establishes that a person under Georgia law includes a child in the womb who has not yet been born. And then throughout the rest of the bill, it affirms that the child in the womb is a person, and that the focus of the bill is not just restricting access to a medical procedure, but it's actually recognizing that right to life and the personhood of the child that's in the womb. And because no court has ever explored that argument in a state law, we believe that the courts, if there is a challenge, if the ACLU has said that they intend to file a lawsuit, and if that's their prerogative, and if they want to explore and compare science from 1973 to science in 2019 and let the Supreme Court determine whether or not Roe v. Wade has standing anymore compared to the Life Act, that's their prerogative. But we believe that that does indeed happen, that we would be ruled favorably because of the unique nature of our law.
All right, we'll see where that legal battle heads. Joshua Edmonds, Executive Director of Georgia Life Alliance. Thanks so much for joining us today, Joshua.
Thanks for having us. I appreciate it.
It does seem like they're trying to make a new legal argument. I understand he thinks that there's some precedent for that, but frankly, we've just seen the courts really responding differently to these sorts of cases, especially as some of those lower courts have tilted more conservative in the last decade.
And the Supreme Court as well.
And the Supreme Court, obviously, as well. I think we should bring in Dr. Leana Wen, who we also have with us, the president of Planned Parenthood. Lena Wen, excuse me, who, I think is bringing a little bit of a different perspective in this. Dr. Wen, want to ask you about, as Devin said, this kind of growing trend of these heartbeat bills. Do you see that taking foot in other states? Where is this going to happen next?
Well, first, we need to call out these bills for what they are. They are a coordinated attack on women's health care and rights. so far this year, there have been 16 states that have filed bills that will limit abortion care early in pregnancy at 6 weeks, when most women don't even know that we're pregnant. And we know the consequence of that, which is that women will die. Look, I'm a doctor, and I know that legalizing abortion did not create the need for it. And if we do not have safe legal abortions, we're going to go back to a time like before Roe versus Wade was passed, when thousands of women in the U.S. died every year because they did not have access to safe legal abortion care. And that's the consequence when these extreme bills are passed. And I also just want to point out the Georgia bill that the previous guest was just talking about. It contains a provision that would allow the state to investigate women for having miscarriages. The bill that's now in Alabama would impose a Class A felony for doctors that perform abortion care, which would give them a sentence of up to 99 years. Texas, Indiana have tried to pass bills this year alone that would criminalize women, actually would impose the death penalty, capital punishment for women who have abortions. This is the landscape of what's happening around the country. And we have to talk about the great threat that there is to women and families.
How concerned are you about the threat in this particular bill, Dr. Wen? As we said, there have been about a dozen so-called heartbeat bills introduced or passed in this country so far. None of them are actually in effect, although we just heard the previous guest say that they have tried to hone the language in this bill out of Georgia so that when it lands, if it lands before the U.S. Supreme Court, they're confident that it will win over the ear of this new conservative majority. Are you concerned about that, or do you think that this one, like all the others, will be blocked?
Look, this bill is unconstitutional. It is illegal and it is harmful. We're talking about lives of women and families that are on the line. We as Planned Parenthood will be suing too, because for us, this is about the rights and the health of our patients. But we need to look deeper at why it is that so many extreme bans on reproductive care are being issued all across the country. And it's because Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court, and these anti-women's health legislators are trying to push up as many bills as they can so that they're challenging Roe versus Wade. I mean, we're hearing these politicians directly say this is why they're trying to get this legislation passed. And if Roe versus Wade is overturned or further eroded, which could very well happen, that means that 1 in 3 women of reproductive age in this country, which is 25 million women, could be living in states where abortion is banned, criminalized, and outlawed. And we need to call out the hypocrisy of these politicians. Look, Georgia, as an example of this, has the second highest maternal mortality rate in the country. A pregnant woman in Georgia is 10 times more likely to die in childbirth than a woman in California. In many of these states that have these extreme bans, Missouri is another example, syphilis is raging. In Missouri, there are 5 counties that have experienced an over 1,000% increase in the rate of syphilis, and congenital syphilis is higher than it's been in decades. What these politicians should be doing is to listen to the will of the people, which is that we want more healthcare and not less. And we should be calling out their hypocrisy, because if they really want to protect life, then they should be expanding healthcare and looking to improve public health for all people, women, children, and families, instead of trying to take healthcare away.
You've been talking a lot about some extreme differences in access to abortion and reproductive care for Americans, depending on which state they live in. Are there any states that have been moving in the other direction that you feel like are expanding access or expanding reproductive health care?
Yes. We know that with Trump in the White House and Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, that states have to be the critical backstop to protect and expand our healthcare and our rights and our freedoms. We look at New York, which after years of work by our champions, the governor has signed into law a bill that would codify Roe into state law. Illinois, where I just was, is also looking to pass a Reproductive Health Equity Act that would treat reproductive health care and women's health care as no differently than what it is, which is health care. this is what the American people want. Support for Roe versus Wade as the law of the land is higher than it's ever been at 73%. Support Roe and the right to safe legal abortion. The American people are saying that we understand that women's healthcare is healthcare, that these rates of maternal mortality are simply unacceptable. It's unacceptable that a woman today in the U.S., that we have a 50% higher chance of dying in childbirth than our mothers. Then an African-American woman is 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. And there's something that we can do about it, which is we have to treat women's healthcare and healthcare as a fundamental human right.
All right, Dr. Leana Wen, the president of Planned Parenthood of America. Thank you so much, Dr. Wen, for coming in and sharing your view. Certainly interesting developments out of Georgia, and we know a number of states pursuing those things as well. We'll continue to stay on it here on ABC News Live. Appreciate your voice in all this. It's certainly particularly going to, at the Supreme Court, going to be a fascinating year ahead with so many cases in the pipeline, not only the 6-week bans, but a number of other things, admitting privileges for doctors.
Right. Funding to Planned Parenthood clinics. Yeah, we've seen a lot of different tactics at the state level to try to restrict abortion. And she made the point, coming to a head right now, as conservatives hope to get some of those cases before this Supreme Court.
And finally today, here in the briefing room, want to give tribute to the First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump, celebrating a 1-year anniversary of her big initiative since joining the White House, Be Best. It's a 3-pronged, child-focused program. She took a victory lap of sorts today in the Rose Garden. She was the only one on stage, which is sort of an interesting moment. The president seated there in the front row. Let's take a listen to a little bit of her tribute.
1 year ago today, I announced Be Best, an awareness campaign dedicated to the children of this country and all over the world. Be Best has 3 pillars: the well-being of children, online safety, and opioid abuse. And it continues to have one goal, which is to educate children and parents about the issues they face and promote programs and services available to help them with today's challenges.
It's unclear what the concrete outcomes have been from her initiatives, but she was celebrated today by a lot of those bipartisan attendees simply for shining the spotlight on a number of topics, Mary Alice, that she's broken with her husband on.
Absolutely. You know, I do think you're right that the campaign has had a hard time kind of defining itself, especially in Washington these days where there's just so much noise and so much drama. It's hard for something positive to break through. We talk about that in the newsroom all the time. But, you know, while the crux has been hard to pinpoint, the First Lady has visited schools in 15 states, also some hospitals, met with 30 diplomats, and reconvened an interagency working group specifically looking at youth programs and how there could be more attention on this issue of protecting the country's kids across an interagency look at that. So we obviously saw sort of a moment here to congratulate her and a nice White House ceremony.
Yeah, even got a number of the cabinet to turn out there as well. Elaine Chao, you saw her in the front row. So hats off to Melania Trump on the 1-year anniversary there. Want to take a look at the stock market before we let you go today. If you haven't noticed today, and check your 401k, the market is spooked again today in light of that news from the White House on the China trade negotiations that are underway ahead of that Friday deadline, with the potential for new tariffs on both sides. You see the Dow is down big again today, certainly concerning to all of us everyday investors. And finally, you heard about it at the top of the show with John Santucci and the investigative team, that exclusive new interview with White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders. That will air coming up next here on ABC News Live, the Investigations podcast. If you can't stay tuned now, be sure to download it with Apple Podcasts and listen at home. And you can download the app as well. The latest on all the stories we've talked about today, and some great analysis from Mary Alice Parks in the note there as well. Great to have you with us, Mary Alice. As always, I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. See you back here tomorrow.